to The Hinge with Noel and Jake, a spiritual meander on the mystery of being human.
Hello, Jake.
Hello, Noel.
Hello, listeners. Even the theme this week is on listening. And even as I said listeners, I could really hear that inside in my body. And we wanted to return to the theme of listening. And there was something you had shared last week that a reminder, or for those who were listening or those who weren't, you had shared with me, Jake, about your experience of going to see someone at a particular time in your life where you sat over a number of years. And you were apologizing to him, I think, for speaking so much. And I think he said to you, "You're the one that needs to talk now." And yeah, so it's really with that, as well as some other pieces we had shared about listening.
Yeah, and it brings me back to the tenderness piece immediately. So the feeling of embarrassment and perhaps discomfort for speaking so much, and meeting a man in his late 70s, very wise man, lots of experience, very caring man. And every time going away from the meeting thinking, shoot, again, I didn't ask him any questions. I just talked. He managed to also create the situation where it was me talking, and there was not, because the sitting is not about figuring out somebody else's biography. It's about you figuring something out for you. But there was this intention before I'd enter, every week. Now I'm going to ask him some questions. But they were somehow never answered, or it didn't happen. And I went into this flow of speech. And I felt often embarrassed about him when I said that to him. He immediately gave it a tender twist and flipped it on his head. Don't busy yourself with that. This is what you need to do and be doing now. And I was speaking to my friend Louisa, and she said, often there's a corporeal aspect to tenderness. And she said, loving is in itself not tender. It's when something gets involved. The word love isn't tender. The loving is tender. The touch, very much the touch. She referenced us talking in the first episode about the hands, the touching of the hands, or the noticing of these things that have to touch. And at the same time, in listening, there's also a tenderness, because you feel in, you bring your body in a way in. Listening is not hearing. In fact, it's quite rude, when we say, "I hear you," I hear what you say, but I couldn't care less. Right? Or with a different intonation, "I hear you." It's like, yeah. We said, "Yeah, I'm truly listening." We don't actually mean I'm hearing. We mean I'm taking this in. So listening is an empathetic act, where we have some skin in the game, where we show true interest and care.
Thinking about what, reflecting upon what you were saying as I was listening to you about skin in the game. Imagine when we're listening, we're risking something. We're moving away from what we might imagine that we already know. And, so that stance, and I'm reflecting upon the experience of listening as a practice, as an ongoing practice in our lives. And that sometimes my listening has been very lazy. I often think of maybe, we get to know people, and something we were talking about earlier on this week, Jake, you were talking about stories, and you were saying, well, we only all have only a number of stories. finite amount of stories. And even though the story of who we are is certainly feels to me infinite and expansive, and sometimes how we listen to our story, I think it's really important. And so sometimes I've found when I've been listening to people and maybe they've said something, maybe I've heard it before, that I've dropped out of listening. I know how this goes. I know this story. I know how it ends. As opposed to giving myself over to the experience. And thinking about us this morning, we always enter into our conversations when this dialogue, when we proceed it by, time in silence. It's a time of listening, really. And dropping below the noise of the mind and the thinking. Which I believe we all kind of listen, whereas the silence that supports us to listen, that receives and the words in a particular way because there's silence, because something in me isn't hurried, and I think life in its busyness limits our capacity to really listen. And there's a lot of noise. Sometimes it's inside us. Sometimes it's outside us. I really appreciate what you were saying about, I hear you. You're like, if you really did, why are you still behaving in that manner? Because I believe that listening at its deepest is healing in itself. And is affirming.
Yeah. And what you say about, there's true listening is offering a willingness to be changed as a consequence of what the other person is saying, to truly be touched by what people say. I was reading a small article by a neuroscientist this morning, and he said in the listening in relationship, it is actually through the limbic system becomes possible to change your partner or the person you have intimate relationship with through listening. Simply you readjust who they are through the way that you are. So not with words, by entering into that relationship through listening. And he proposed that as a listening practice. So truly empathetic, involved, engaged listening. We change each other. I'm not sure if I completely understood how it works, but I mean, just that possibility that listening actively, but not in the traditional way of like ask open questions, do lots of nodding, make gesticulations to make sure that the speaker is absolutely sure that you are listening, but listening through a silent presence where actually much more profoundly somebody realizes that you are there. And of course it helps that they can see you. But if you think about the Samaritans on the phone, people can't see them, but they try to listen as much as possible. They have some listening techniques that are a little bit that affirmation and clarification of questions. So, but as you get more comfortable with being listened to, there's actually very little necessary apart from the awareness or the consciousness of the witness.
What you were sharing about that article and how we change and are changed, that true dialogue, changes us. And I was I think your phrase was, that you are here, and I think when I've been experienced somebody who's really listened to me, I know it's changed something in me, a sense of that I am here, that, a sense of belonging, a sense of, because being heard at that level, and you talk about the limbic system and the resonances, and it's like this beautiful dance. And yet, oftentimes, I know for me, as somebody who's loved words, curiously, I also love silence. To work, as you were saying last week, Jay, to be conscious of allowing space for others. And that the listening is a way of encouraging somebody to become known. Because I think that's, one of the deepest callings of us all is to be known. I think Corinthians, I'm no biblical scholar, but I think Corinthians says to know as fully as I am known. And as I understand that in my own way of walking and falling and getting up, is that the contemplative life, the listening that's inherent in a contemplative life, really supports that, really supports us to be known.
Yes.
And if I can attend to somebody with a curious ear and an open ear. And so your lovely, you shared a story last week also, I think it was from King Solomon. I think you remember
yes.
that? Yeah.
Yes. When Solomon can ask anything of God that he would like to ask, and that he makes the right choice for the thing that he's being asked. So he asks for a listening heart, or the ear of the heart, the ability to listen with discernment, to be a just ruler. And it says something, and God was pleased that he didn't ask something for himself, but he asked something to be able to serve, right? And then, of course, God said, because you're such a good guy, I'll give you all the rest that you could have asked as well, right? But you asked to be able to serve. And I think it is just my preferred translation. I don't think that the discerning heart is perhaps a more accurate translation, which is beautiful, a discerning heart. But give me the ear of the heart, or give me a listening heart. It is really about, when I listen to you, when you make your case before the tribunal, or you ask me for a favor and I am your king, you try to hear, what is it that you are looking for? What is it in you that is asking to be seen, to be heard? And on that basis, I will try to make a just decision. And of course, when we go into a court of law, it's the plea that's the best story that wins. The truth is just the best story, because they're just perspectives, right? So when we can get into the empathetic brain of the other, and therefore, say, this is what will trigger them, this is what is important to them, it's more compelling. And for that, we have to know ourselves well, and we have to be capable of loving, really, haven't we? And it's not always easy. I think for me, the sitting before we start is very important, because for me to get settled and focused in these conversations would be much more difficult otherwise.
And part of the joy for me is because I sit, every day, with myself. Of course, I'm never alone. I'm always sitting in the presence of the presence. Another way for me to sing in front of in God, that I bring myself to sit to this rendezvous. that when we sit together, we get to sit together, even though we're in different spaces. And it reminds me of that story of, maybe it's from the Buddhist tradition, you put one log in the fire and it's nice, it's warm. You put two logs in the fire and it get, into that. And it's like, for people listening to us, there's a lot of logs in the fire. And it's quality of listening. And I could hear inside myself, Jake, as I was listening to you, recognizing the imperfection of my listening. I could hear inside me, and I was reminded of the yearning that's inside us all, and the yearning that was inside me. And that still is, that moved us towards, listening to what was being invited into our lives and letting go of familiar places. I often reflect when I sit with people, you probably, Jake, you've heard me say this, and certainly friends of mine have heard me say this, and, talking about therapy, which I value and I appreciate, and I sit, and I think a way I've been thinking about it a lot lately is that it's listening. That's hopefully I'm doing very little, but there's a listening at depth. And I was thinking about a teacher of mine that I was lucky enough to sit with, Jim Finlay. And when you ask him a question, it's like he'd hear the question underneath the question. It was something else to witness the quality of his listening. Such is the quality of his presence. No, like us all, he's human. I'm sure for you, Jake, for me, there are days you say, "Oh, that didn't go so bad." I think there was something of value there. And then other days it's like, "Oh, no." Yeah.
And those of you who haven't seen Jim Finlay speak when he offers retreats, and some of them are recorded on YouTube. I haven't met the man in person, but I've heard him speak on a number of podcasts and also give some retreats. And of course, he's also nearly 80 now, he's even 80. But a lot happens in a short period of time, but he's moving very slowly and mostly speaks quite slowly to really get also let all the participants get on the same page. And so things are really settling. And often there's a lot of sense making of the question that is being asked without answering the question. So there's no attempt at answering the question. There's first about picking the question apart and so trying to understand, and it's the different aspects of the question, right? And then offering a potential answer. I seem to remember also that he's not giving a definitive answer, but say one thing could be an answer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exactly it. You're reminding me. I was as part of the program over 2 years. I got to sit with Jim. With a lot of other students around the world. But I'd never asked a question. For 2 years in the program, and one of the last times that we were sitting together and he was doing a teaching, I was hearing, said, "Oh, there's a question inside me," and I stood up to ask the question. And then I realized, because I was waiting, because he was completing an answer to somebody else's question. And I realized as I stood up that the question had fallen away. And there was another question inside me beneath the question that I was asking. And so I shared something of that with him. I said, "I actually don't have a question." I said, "There's another one forming." And he said to me, not to me, he said to all of us, was just he said to me, he said to all of us, he said, "It's important not to do violence to your waiting." And I was so struck by that generosity of listening. And the gift for me in as I was listening to myself, I felt like I learned something new in that moment about really listening underneath the most immediate question. Because I think oftentimes, isn't it, the most immediate question is the surface question. But I think the deeper question is, who am I? That's one of the deepest questions. Who am I?
Mm.
Not in this kind of self-infatuated way. Who am I? But more, who am I in the eyes of God? Who does he know me to be? I often think of, it's how I hear the Buddhist story that says, what was the shape of your face before your grandparents were born? It's like, what the hell?
Yeah.
But this capacity of listening, and I guess in that, that tradition of mindfulness and meditation and non-reactivity. Because when we sit and we listen to ourselves and to one another, it's I imagine in the world that if we could sit quietly and listen, the healing that would take hold in some of the most hurt places inside us and between us, something would begin to shift, as you were saying from that article you read this morning, Jake.
Yeah. I imagine that when the importance of listening as a tool for peace talks, right? And I imagine that you could actually sit in a circle with two warring factions, and you'd sit there for however long it'd take, let's say a week, and at the end of that week, and nobody had spoken, and they'd all get up and walk away as if there had never been a problem, right? Because what we're doing is just ridiculous, isn't it? I need this piece of land. I need oil for me. We can't have people live here. We've pillaged all of Africa, but now we don't want them to come here to share in a little bit of the wealth that we took from them. All that sort of, as if we are separate. We're one species, we're one people, right? And of course, if you sit in silence for long enough, you see that I am no different from you. I am you. And very often we have this experience when I have an argument with somebody and I walk away from that. And then after a while, I try to think, what is the point that I'm trying to make here? And I'm just seeing the ridiculousness of me wanting to be right. I'm thinking, is it true? No, I kind of wanted it to be that way. Is what the other person said true? Yeah, well, at least as much as my truth is true. Right? And it becomes quite easy to say, I'm sorry. Can we forget about it? Just continue where we were before this nonsense happened. And it is partly embarrassing, to be so small. But then you have to be big enough to step over that. Say, that was just childish, stupid, ignorant, unnecessary. As much as it is necessary to forgive yourself for that stupidity, I think that's probably what engenders the courage to step over and say, okay, that was stupid. It's embarrassing. Not the whole world doesn't necessarily have to know. Forgive yourself. But the penance for forgiving yourself is get over yourself. Go and reach out. And very often when we reach out, sometimes it takes a little bit of leaning in because the other is not really ready to accept a peace offering. But then you've got to stay with it and say, maybe they're not ready, but you at least take your responsibility. You don't have to take their responsibility. They're not right. They're not wrong. What you did was not helpful. And that can often diffuse. And so this listening to ourselves, instead of the relativity of everything surfaces through that. And I think it gets easier over time for me to apologize. Not because I'm getting light-hearted, like, oh yeah, I've got a problem. I don't really want the problem. I'll just say sorry and then we'll move on. But I'm becoming a little bit faster at saying, I think I'm seeing a pattern here. This is just not true. It's, So what am I going to do? Sit here for a week and be stubborn, or just get up and say, can we turn back the clock a little bit and say that was not, I shouldn't have said it. Right now, the trick is, of course, to not say it at all. But but I'm not there yet.
No, I suppose that's, isn't it, for us all? We're a work in progress. I'm not, as you say, Jake, I'm not there yet. I'm perfect in my imperfection.
That's right. Perfect in your imperfection.
Gentlemen, what about a short break? Welcome back to The Hinge with Noel and Jake. Please support us by following The Hinge podcast on Patreon, YouTube, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Listening. Listening is a form of worship, but you don't have to kneel on the floor with folded hands or mouth the perfect prayer. Just open the door of yourself to another. Become this space they step through to show you who they are. This is holiness. Two people seated together on the pew of a park bench or the altar of a kitchen table. Even if no one says a word for a while, receive the silence until it's like a new language only the two of you can speak.
Yeah, especially that last phrase, the language only two of you can speak. And it's because the uniqueness of a relationship, right? The irreplaceability, not in necessarily a marriage, but between brothers and sisters, between friendships that have developed over time, and your relationship with the child. Of course, and that's where the pain comes from, because of if there's a loss of so much beauty that can never be replaced.
Mm.
And the hankering for that thing that is now no longer a language only two of you can speak, and the possibility that it is available anywhere, this worship, and the agency that you have to create it.
Yeah. Yeah, that poem is, I think, just as I listen and how I digest that poem, listen to you, Jake, the agency to create it, the language only two can understand, that resonance, that empathic resonance that you were talking about earlier. Sometimes somebody doesn't say anything, they look at a particular way, look at you a particular way, and in that moment they know that you know what they're speaking about, even though they've used no words.
Yeah.
And I was reminded of that. There's a beautiful man, there's many beautiful men and women that I work with, but there was a beautiful man that I worked with, one of the beautiful people that I worked with one time in a group, a men's group over a day. And he said, they heard me, even though I didn't say a word.
Mm.
And such was the power of that a number of the other men that were there that day came to me afterwards, and sitting with them in the weeks afterwards, and they shared that statement. It's paradoxical, isn't it? And yet, what the poet James Green says from that poem, that listening is a form of worship. That Nellie Morton, who did a lot of work with, I think she was a theologian. I don't know her work at any great depth, but I know she worked with women who had been violated. And, it's a phrase that I've heard her use, we heard each other into speech.
I remember.
Yeah. And I think about the tenderness in us all. But sometimes there can be a hesitancy in speaking. And yet if the quality of my listening is like an open door, and I don't even use a word because I sometimes feel if I use a word, I'll frighten the speaker. Yeah. And just simply being present with a quality of openness and spaciousness, where they'll hear themselves say something, or they'll risk saying something because they're listening to themselves. And I often feel like that the ending of the therapeutic encounter, of the healing encounter, is often signified when people are listening to themselves at a whole new level. Now, it often changes their life and radicalizes their lives in ways that, they've probably gone through some things, and, people don't end up in therapy rooms because life's a hoot. Yeah. Because the listening moves, it feels like, you were saying this at the start, Jake, but that word, that your friend Louisa used,
corporeal.
Corporeal, thank you, Jake.
Of the body, yeah.
Of the body. Yeah. That when you listen, when I listen to people, movement is, and their own movement out of deeper work is, their listening is much more embodied, less cerebral.
Yeah. I think it's also probably helpful for me as a listener to feel my body. And when you often reference to the how it feels in my body, but that awareness is actually sensing the space that is there, also potentially in the other, right? So this resonance of how does that feel, because I know what it feels like to lose someone, a loved one. So when somebody's speaking about it, you can hold the space with that felt sense, with that awareness of what it might feel like. So your timing is also getting better, right? Of how long the silence, how long maybe, and sometimes it can just be a nod of the head that can be the encouragement that's needed. So a lot is so much is done by withholding speech. But not in a mechanical way, like I'm going to shut up, I'm not going to say a single thing because this is going to work for me. Yeah, the art of listening is difficult to grasp, isn't it?
I think you're
fully present.
I think that's so true, Jake, isn't it? I know we've been talking about different trainings we were on, maybe spiritual direction, and just thinking about this moment, maybe in psychotherapy, you learn the use of silence as a kind of technique. And actually, if you use it as a technique, no, it's natural, like any practice. And I would certainly suggest that listening is a spiritual practice, is an ongoing spiritual practice for our lives. And so I imagine people use practices like mindfulness meditation, centering prayer. We'll maybe share in other episodes some pieces around these things, and because, as you say, you sense it. Whereas if I'm efforting, I won't withhold speech, as you said. There's an efforting which takes away from the quality of your presence. Yeah. And therefore the quality.
I can remember for the spiritual direction course that I did in Wales at the Jesuit Formation Institute in Wales and Bynos. That the best thing for me was the practice, the practicing it, the role playing it. First it was role playing it, and then it was actual spiritual direction of each other, and how difficult that was. It was difficult because in coaching there's slightly more intervention, there can be a lot more intervention. And just have 2 weeks of every day, 3 sessions of either observing or listening or speaking in where is a movement toward God? Where were the consolations? Where were the desolations? How do you create the space for the other to have that experience? In the beginning, I felt very wrong-footed, very difficult, much harder than I expected. Maybe I was even thinking, "Oh yeah, I'll figure this one out." I don't know. I don't think I came with any preconceived ideas, but I was shocked about how much harder it was than I'd expected. I went in with an open mind, but I thought I had an open mind, but I didn't think it was going to be this hard.
Yeah,
it's quite something.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how listening, the open mind, the open heart, and how listening is the bridge, puts, as people say, the mind into the heart, which feels to me like, give me the ear of the heart, which almost sounds like, again, it's paradoxical that the heart is an ear, and the heart is an extraordinary organ of perception. It listens and sees much more clearly than I was laughing, Jake, because I was thinking about in Haikomi psychotherapy and body-oriented psychotherapy. I did some of the training for that, and they'd have these exercises where there were no interventions. Like one of them, for example, was you listen to somebody speak for 3 to 5 minutes on any topic of their choice. They could have been reading from the phone book, it didn't matter. And you simply listened in a group of 3 or 4, or how many was in your group. And as you listened, you listened for what touched you, what nourished you about the other person. It could be their tone, it could be some of their movement. It just kind of blew my mind about listening. And also the experience when you're listened to at that level of depth. And I share a big shout out to my circle group. I'm part of the circle group in the United States, England, and here. And I'm the only fella from Éire and from Ireland. But what we do is we meet once a month and somebody speaks for 5 minutes and everybody else listens. There's no saving, there's no fixing, and there's no advising. What a relief. What a relief. There's no crosstalk. It's the essence of a good fellowship meeting in AA. Yet people will say, I identify, but they don't allow you to crosstalk. That's not that, say, because we're human, but it's that continuous practice that really supports people to refine to standard the edges. And go, oh.
So is that why in AA you start with I am so and so and I'm an alcoholic to prevent the crosstalk?
Yeah, I actually don't know, but it kind of makes sense. I am, like even that statement, like I am, like it's an affirmation.
Yeah.
And the like if we think about some of the 12 steps, the first is the listening and recognizing that my life has become unmanageable and I'm powerless over alcohol. It's a listening to the depth of the vulnerability inside me. It's a listening to my imperfection.
Yeah.
It's a listening that says, I tried to do it my way. Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. Yeah, Frank.
It didn't really work.
Yeah, there's not a way to go. There's something so beautiful about people who listen, I feel, not as a reaction, as a response to the truth of who they are.
Yeah. And it's not easy to well, at least let me speak for myself. It was not easy to come to the appreciation. It was I think I was lucky enough to have the curiosity for listening, But beyond that, I was pretty much lost, And I think one of the great inspirations was my spiritual director, Henk. Thought if a man could listen like that, man, wow. Now, how do you go about that? No idea. And that way, a kind of a journey started. And my first prayer of the day is one of the lines is, and that I listen more than I speak. That's one of my requests for the day. And so I started working, even though people from adult development work don't like that some of these practices are offered in corporate. I am of a different opinion, and so offering way of counsel, circle talk, where there is spontaneous contributions spoken from the heart, listened to from the heart, no crosstalk, no fixing, confidentiality assured. In a corporate context, I have a number of clients who have been brave enough to say, let's do something that's completely out there, that he's pitching this to us, but it makes probably no sense. I made them a nice presentation to kind of like explain to them what we might be doing. And they probably thought, well, I don't know what he's talking about, but we've been working with him for a while. He does some strange things. We've done the Ho'oponopono dance with him as well. So we might let's give this a shot. And the first session, they probably left thinking, yeah. And the second session, they kind of think, well, but they committed to doing it for a year because I said, there's no point. And sure enough, after a year, they say, can we have another year? So something, and I can imagine if I was them, I'd probably think, I don't really know what's going on here, but there's something right about it. And then I had a client last year who said, we want to do something else for a while. Well, it's a free country. It's a free world. Well, that's what we say. Is that what we tell each other? And 6 months later, they came back and said, we're not having the conversations that we have when we sit together. Right. And I was, and they were kind of like, they thought it was curious and a little bit funny, but also confusing. Like, how come that having a good conversation, sitting in a circle where there's no crosstalk? Because it's just different from all the other ways of talking that there are, right? Solutions, interruptions, fixing, correcting, debating, right? Of just saying, what's going on, guys? Well, for me, it's like this. Okay. No, it's not like that. Yes, it is like that for him. Really, it is. For him, for her, it's like that. Yeah, but I think, tell us what it is for you. And after a while, the whole group gets quite good at understanding that you are just making a contribution, putting another piece of wood in the fire to create more clarity in the room. That's all you need to do. And the other people will make of that what they need to make of that. You don't have to worry about how it will be interpreted. Just say, this is what it's like for me. It's magical.
And I listening to you, I was thinking about sensing just how extraordinary that practice is, like their own capacity to go away with one of the clients, corporate clients, to go away 6 months and to listen to themselves and to have the courage to listen. We're not having the same conversations, and to follow that listening back. And also as individuals, I know for me, and I know I've also unfortunately at times been this way with others, where there's been a real violence to my listening. A kind of coming in to say, well, this is the way it is. And I can't tell how many meetings I've been at over the years, working in lots of different places, where, as you say, it's my listening is about when I'm listening, I'm either listening, as Krishnamurti says, for an echo of my own opinion. Krishnamurti was an Indian spiritual teacher who came to the United States, or so I'm full of my own prejudice, I'm full of my own opinions, so there's not enough space in my listening. But even sometimes then as an individual where I felt as I've been listening to, that somebody has come in to tell me how I'm wrong and I'm mistaken.
Mm.
And that actually I'm not seeing it at all clearly. But I love your symbol of the image of we're all putting a little stick in the fire, but we're not the actual fire.
No.
You know.
And our stick is not that important, and yet essential, right? It's just another stick, and it's an important stick, but it's no different from the other sticks. But it supports to deal with the ego, that says me, see me.
Hear me.
Yeah, hear me. It's really important what I have to say. And it was embarrassing for me to realize that actually that is actually not that interesting, right? And that there were sometimes people saying things that I'd never thought of, and I was just giving them the space to hear them. But also the correction, which there's the lie of feedback for many people. They ask you, can I give you some feedback? And then they start critiquing you like there's no tomorrow. Doesn't sound like feedback, because this is not really building me up, right? And how do you compassionately respond to that? Because I can remember when I didn't know what to do with feedback, and it just with bad feedback, right? Not with criticism, so not feedback. My first step was to say to people, can I give you feedback? No, thanks. Because I thought, I know from the relationship that we have that you're just going to tell me everything that I did wrong. I'll feel bad about myself. And actually, what I've seen myself doing was adequate. Yeah, I'm not the best at this job, but it was good enough. I was prepared. It was clear. I'm happy with what happened. Right. And this is maybe not the right moment now for me in my tender moment to be trampled on by you. So no, thank you.
Yeah.
But then as it progressed of trying to have a kind dialogue, trying to understand what is the value of the feedback that you claim to be giving me, and what do you propose I do with this, and why is it that you felt that you needed to tell me, and what do you think I'll be doing with that? Were all experimentations of trying to have a listening conversation with that person that could potentially teach both of us something, right? Because it can also be that I feel something as criticism and it is actually feedback. I think I was mostly on point. And the next step was for me to stop being more self-referring, auto-referential, I guess is the term, by neither claiming the compliment nor the criticism. So just say thank you and to move on. Yeah. That was brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, because it wrong foots you. I mean, what you were fine as you were, and then somebody tries to polish you up. Yeah, it's just prepping you for the fall, right? So as much as the criticism is prepping you to be picked up, which is probably a nicer experience. So but that just. That is what they are. People need to tell you something. Are they telling it for you, or are they telling it for themselves?
I suppose the listening, just as I hear you, so appreciate, be aware of, as you say, flattery or criticism, that the ego, I feel in my own life, I feel as I've listened to others, if we share, Jake, that the listening, has it been a scaffold for my ego, or maybe my listening, because a couple of times today you've been generously shared, you talked about it was embarrassing, and I smiled because I know that in myself, that a listening has deconstructed the scaffold, not even necessarily the ego, but the scaffold that I've had around. And then as I've really listened some more, it's just really just begun to dissolve what has hardened around my heart. And I think we shared last week about, reminded of that phrase from listenings opens that which pain has closed.
It's probably not a surprise that culturally we're often on the go, or let me tell you what you should do, right? I wish you wouldn't. Because I'm really struggling to hear my own sense of it myself. And, and that's why I speak for myself, but also we wouldn't be sitting here otherwise in this encounter, is why you and I so appreciate listening. And I'm reflecting upon Jake, when you said to Henk, God, to be able to listen like that. I think I also shared this last week when we sat together, that if you spot it, you got it. You appreciated something, like me with Jim Finley. And okay, I don't always hear the question underneath the question, but something in me does sometimes. And I'm so delighted sometimes if it leads to somebody's, because I think listening liberates.
Yeah. I think we're coming full circle.
I think we are.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
See you next week.
See you next week.
You have been listening to The Hinge, a podcast presented by Noel O'Driscoll and Jake Espin, produced by Jer Kellett. Feel free to contact the show in the comments or by emailing us at thehingepodcast@gmail.com. Join us next week for another episode of The Hinge.